Morning. We are in the middle of chapter 271, Reish Ein Aleph, Yalter B'Shulchan Aruch, Laws of Kiddush. We are holding halacha number 5. The last thing we said did come from our Gemara in Psachim, which is the question of the biblical nature of Kiddush. Right? We divided Kiddush into two. There's the cup of wine, which is rabbinic, and there's the recitation of the blessing, which is biblical in nature, which means hypothetically, and in some circumstances, actually, one fulfills the Kiddush in the recitation of the blessing during Ma'ariv. Nonetheless, there's a rabbinic obligation to have a cup of wine. Then we continued and said that the Kiddush of Yom Tif is entirely rabbinic, right? Because the biblical injunction to have Kiddush is Zachar Siyam Shabbos Akachai, make mention of the Shabbos to sanctify it. In the Ten Commandments, make mention, Zachar. No such statement appears with regard to holidays. Make mention of the holiday to sanctify it. Doesn't exist. Only by Shabbos. And therefore, biblically speaking, there is no obligation to sanctify Shabbos, to declare its sanctity through Kiddush. And therefore, the practical ramification of that is, if one is left with one cup of wine, tonight is Yom Tif, tomorrow night is Shabbos, keep it for Shabbos because that's your primary higher level mitzvah. And that took us on to a discussion of whether one can delay mitzvah or forego a current mitzvah of a lower standing for a mitzvah that might become later of a higher nature. Right, this case in history, this fascinating story, well-known story throughout the Shiloh Tshuva's literature, the response to literature of the guy who was stuck in jail and was allowed to be released once a year. And the question is which day to choose. That was the discussion. Take tomorrow because it's the first opportunity, or delay it for the day with the best mitzvahs on it. Right, and then that had ramifications here too. Take the first opportunity to make Kiddush and a cup of wine, or wait for tomorrow. But the Alter Rebbe concluded that no matter which way you stand on the question of the guy in jail, because the mitzvah today is rabbinic and tomorrow is biblical, you take tomorrow's mitzvah, which is biblical. That's what it seems from the Alter Rebbe.
It seems like the first biblical mitzvah that comes up is the right?
Well, okay, we haven't.
No?
We don't know that from the Alter Rebbe yet. That if you have two biblical mitzvahs, should you forego one for the other? We don't know that. But in this case, because one is rabbinic and one is biblical, the Alter Rebbe is concluding that you take the biblical one tomorrow rather than the rabbinic one today. Which, in other words, what the Alter Rebbe is trying to do is he's trying to separate this case from the case there.
So you might have to wait a week.
Yeah. Well, assuming you have no cup of wine coming in a week. But here, it's much easier. We have Thursday night, Thursday night is Yom Tif, and the next night, Friday night, is Shabbos.
So you wait for Friday night.
So wait for the next day, because you know that in the next 24 hours, you're not getting a cup of wine. If you're talking about waiting until next week, whatever, you have a whole week to go get wine. Go make a few bucks or go ask for money, borrow money, and get a cup of wine.
For the guy who's in jail.
Yeah.
He's told.
Only once a day you can come out.
Only once a day.
Once a year, sorry, 1 day a year.
He has to wait a maximum of 7 days.
For Kiddush, maybe you should come out tomorrow morning for Tefillin.
That's true.
You can come, right? So this discussion. Perhaps one day we'll explore all the various different avenues of how to think about that, because it's a very fascinating discussion which lasted for decades and a century, more or longer. It's a rather very famous discussion because of the wide-ranging applications when you have to choose between one mitzvah and another, delaying a current mitzvah or foregoing a current mitzvah for the sake of a better one later, and how do you qualify better anyway? Right? That's a whole window that perhaps we'll explore one day.
To fulfill a biblical commandment
of Kiddush. No.
Just a biblical commandment.
You don't need wine, no. For the biblical commandment, you don't need wine. Nonetheless, because you have two Kiddush opportunities, one biblical, one rabbinic. Also, I'm going to make mention of this point. I was going to bring it up later, but I'll bring it up now. Something we talked about the last time we learned was my understanding of the reading of the Alter Rebbe is as follows. On a regular Friday night, okay, keep this in mind because it's going to come important soon. On a regular Friday night, when you daven Ma'ariv, and then you make Kiddush at home, which of those two did you fulfill your biblical obligation with?
Friday.
So I'm going to make the case that actually you fulfill your biblical kiddush at kiddush when you're holding a cup of wine. In an instance where, for whatever reason, you don't want to use your kiddush at home for your biblical obligation, you can rely on your ma'ariv as your biblical obligation. In other words, like this: when the sages enacted you should hold a cup of wine for your kiddush, the enactment was that you should hold a cup of wine when you fulfill your biblical obligation. So it's as if I am choosing to use my kiddush at home with a cup of wine as the fulfillment of my biblical obligation, even though, if for whatever reason I can't use that one, I'm going to rely on my ma'ariv for my biblical. Why am I saying that? Go back to halacha number. This is going to be important coming soon, but I want to make this point clearly because you look at halacha number 3. Look at halacha number 3. No, sorry, not there. Halacha number 2. I'm sorry. The last paragraph of halacha 2. Yes. Oh, exactly. So he's talking about the person. Oh, exactly. The person who's supposed to make kiddush right away. Right? You're supposed to make kiddush as soon as possible. Now, you're not hungry right now. You just had a big supper. And you have to have kiddush in the place of your meal. So if you make kiddush at the earliest opportunity, you're not going to enjoy your meal because you're full. And therefore, he wants to delay his meal. So says the Alter Rebbe, he can do so if he has no appetite just then. He may wait to recite Kiddush as far into the night as he desires, so that he will recite Kiddush when he will eat with appetite. He may rely on his mention of Shabbos in the evening service to fulfill the requirement of sanctifying the Shabbos upon its commencement. So he's relying on his Kiddush that he did in Ma'ariv to demonstrate that he made Kiddush as soon as possible. But the language here implies that had he not been reliant on that, he would have fulfilled his obligation during the Kiddush with the wine. Right? So which means, even though when I make Kiddush Friday night, when I daven Ma'ariv Friday night, it's before my Kiddush, I still have not yet fulfilled my biblical obligation. I'm only going to do it when I make Kiddush at night. Now, if it so happens that my Kiddush at night is being delayed, then I'm going to rely on my Ma'ariv for my biblical.
So as not to unnecessarily
not unnecessarily delay my Kiddush. This is going to become important coming up shortly. So let's put a pin in that. Keep in mind, let's go to halacha 5.
The requirement that your Kiddush has to be made in the place of your meal.
That the requirement that the Kiddush be done in the place of a meal seems to be associated with your wine Kiddush. Seems to be associated with your wine Kiddush, but that's a very good point. It's a good point. Yeah, it seems so. Okay, let's look at halacha 5. Sorry?
I would think so too.
Yeah, it would seem so.
That's a bracha of benefit when you have the wine component.
Right. But also I should add this. If I'm correct in that on a regular Friday night, even though you daven Ma'ariv first, you're still only fulfilling your obligation, biblically even, when you make Kiddush on the cup of wine. And that would mean on a regular Friday night, you're actually eating your meal at your biblical Kiddush too, which is with your cup of wine, even though you've made Kiddush earlier, even though you daven Ma'ariv earlier.
So it sounds like you can choose which one you want to delineate as your biblical Kiddush.
So I'm going to, okay, I'll go a step further. Exactly. So I'll go a step further. It's not that I choose. It's the rabbinic enactment that says, make your Kiddush over a cup of wine that chooses for me. In a circumstance where I'm not, then I'm relying on the Kiddush earlier. But in other words, the rabbinic setup of how I'm supposed to fulfill the biblical commandment chooses for me when I'm fulfilling my biblical commandment. In other words, the rabbinic structure around which they want us to fulfill the biblical command informs the manner in which I fulfill my biblical command.
Right.
Because when I go about performing mitzvahs, I'm completely reliant on the sage's structure. I don't, in other words, till we learned this class, right, who were we relying on when we made Kiddush and Havdalah and Ma'ariv and everything? We followed this procedure because it's in the that we rely on the sages who structured it this way. Right? So because I'm relying on the sage's structure as I perform my mitzvahs, and whenever they have in mind, it informs my decisions, even if I'm not aware about it. The language in halacha is Leiv Bezdin Masna Aleim. The heart of Bezdin makes the condition for them. This is the Gemara's language in reference to a number of laws, especially about the temple laws, in which the Bezdin, by the decisions of how they structure their organization in the temple, that's the way the Kohen does it, even if the Kohen isn't aware of these conditions. Because Lev Bezdin Masnale, and the heart of Bezdin makes the condition for them, which is logical. Because again, until we learned this, who were we relying on when we did all this stuff? Did we know which was biblical, which was rabbinic? Not necessarily. So what did we do? Our sages instructed it this way. This is what we do it, right? So the framing in which they structured how we should fulfill our biblical obligation indeed informs how I do it. So if the sages want that I should fulfill my biblical obligation when I'm holding a cup of wine, that's when I'll do it. Not because I'm aware of it, but because that's the way they instituted it. On extraneous circumstances where I'm exactly in extraneous circumstances where I'm delaying my kiddush late at night because I'm not hungry yet, or because my wife is not ready to eat yet, so I'm delaying my kiddush till later. So I'm relying on the kiddush I did in my. This is going to come up soon. Important
areas when the person didn't have.
Oh, you didn't have ma'ariv. Now it's an issue. You can't delay your kiddush. Can't delay your meal. That's right. That's a good point.
Most of them don't do kiddush.
We do. We go home and make kiddush. How long after ma'ariv do you make kiddush? Most on regular Friday night, you come here, you're davening Kabbalah Shabbos, ma'ariv, go home, make kiddush.
Yeah.
That's it. How long later? Half an hour later, 20 minutes later. Not so long later.
Right. If you're gonna eat, let's say 10 o'clock.
So then you're relying on your kiddush from ma'ariv. Yeah, but why are you doing it a second time? Why are you doing kiddush a second time?
Because you're doing it tomorrow.
Right. You're doing it in ma'ariv. Yeah. 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 So in ma'ariv, you're relying on your biblical obligations that it was done as early as possible, and you're doing it again later for the rabbinic enactment. But ordinarily, you'd be doing your biblical with your rabbinic over the cup of wine.
So then, if you do your kiddush on time at home, does the one in Ma'ariv now not considered? It's now transforms into something that's not considered biblical.
Oh, so that's right. So if I do it ordinarily,
so it's almost like the electrons, they kind of oscillate
based on, they react to each other. So yes, in other words, like this. What you're asking is as follows. If I go through the procedures in a regular Friday night, I daven ma'ariv, I come home, I make kiddush on time, no problem. And I'm suggesting here that when the biblical commandment is fulfilled at the moment you make kiddush with a cup of wine, right? Yeah. As per the sage's instruction. Yeah. So then what exactly how exactly do I qualify what I did in ma'ariv?
Right. Now what is it?
My answer to that is
the same thing.
It's prayer.
Prayer.
It's prayer.
So it oscillates.
It's prayer. It so happens,
prayer, or it could be a mitzvah.
It so happens that my prayer declares the sanctity of Shabbos, and therefore, in theory, that's enough for kiddush because all you have to do biblically is declare the sanctity of Shabbos. So in other words, it's really a prayer.
Oh, that really fits well.
It's a prayer. Now it so happens that my prayer declares the sanctity of Shabbos, therefore I can rely on that to fulfill my biblical obligation. But really, it's just a prayer.
Right. I think there's a lot of
right. Let's perhaps think about it that way.
Are like that, though, in a sense. They're like the bare minimum, but the sages always enact something
to give it proper weight, to give it more, safety guard, to give it more prestige, whatever the sage's logic is, right? To give it more ceremony, right?
It's like, for example, Eru, you can walk. How many mil you can walk by Torah law?
Yeah.
But the sages said no, 2,000 almost.
I'll give you another closer example. Shema. Yeah. Biblically speaking, all you have to do to fulfill your obligation in the morning is all you need to do in the morning is all you need to do in the morning. All you need to do is say the Shema. So if you wake up in the morning, yeah, and you say brachas, you say your morning brachas, and as you should, you follow your brachas right with Shema. Why am I doing that? Why am I saying Shema right after my brachas? Because in case my davening is delayed, and my davening is delayed after the time for the obligation of Shema, I fulfilled my obligation already because I said Shema right after brachas. But what happens if I didn't delay? I made it in time to the minyan, and I said Shema then. When did I fulfill my biblical obligation? When I made Shema after my brachas, when I daven Shema and davening. When I daven Shema and davening. Why? Because that's when I say Shema with all the brachas around it, which is the way the sages wanted me to do it. Not biblically, rabbinically, the sages wanted me to say Abbas Olam Bar Asher Yetziram Oidos and as if I was saying Gal Yisrael, all those brachas, and they wanted me to make it next to my tefillah. They whatever all the other obligations they wanted to do, right? So, but why did I do it earlier? Just in case something happens and my davening is delayed, at least I got my biblical obligation done. But if I had to choose which one's my biblical obligation, the one in davening, which is done with all the rabbinic bolsterings and brachas and so on. A similar example.
That's why in the morning, on Sunday morning, you take the class with your father.
You say Shema earlier.
You say the Shema right away.
So you should, as a rule, you should make it part of your routine. Wake up in the morning when you make brachas goes right into Shema.
The Siddur only carries the first paragraph.
Right.
You should do all.
All of them.
At what time?
Yeah, I always do so. First thing in the morning, brachas, wash my hands, it's just all the brachas, and right into Shema. There are those who even put on tefillin then to say Shema, and then put on tefillin again later for davening. There are those who do that also, and there's good reason to do so, although I don't. But there's such good reason. I say all three. Why not?
Make sure
At least the first paragraph, certainly, but all three, why not? Just in case you covered everything. And then if davening is late for whatever reason, at least you did your biblical obligation of saying Shema in the morning before the time. Yeah, again, as I mentioned, there are those who even put on tefillin for that. But I don't do that. Okay, let's keep this all in mind. Let's go to halacha 5.
The art scroll consider is designed that way.
It puts the Shema right after brachas. Okay, that's Ashkenaz custom to have tefillin even by brachas. I'm saying even in Chabad custom where we don't have talis and tefillin by brachas, there are many who will put on tefillin just for the Shema for whatever reason. And they don't have to wear talis because they're wearing the small talis. They're wearing the small sons of their shirts anyway. Okay, well, we're gonna leave that alone for now.
Yeah.
Okay, halacha 5. So the next few discussions don't really come from our Gemara in Psachim. It comes from the Gemara in Brachas and Kiddushin, which is where there in Kiddushin discusses the laws of, or the nature of the women's obligation in mitzvahs. Right, the principle we know, which is all prohibitions they are commanded in. Anytime a Torah says don't do something, they're commanded to refrain from doing that, irrespective of whether it's time bound or not. And when the Torah says to do something, a positive commandment, then they're exempt if it's time bound. That's the rule. Now let's see. Now this is something we touched upon when we learned the laws of. Yeah, we're getting to that now. Okay. So we learned we touched upon it when we learned the halachas of women making Havdalah, and there he cited to the discussion here. Right, that was chapter 298, and he cited there to 271, which is what we're looking at right now. So let's read halacha 5. I'll read in the Hebrew. You're welcome to follow along in English. Noshim chayavos b'kiddush hayom. Women are obligated to sanctify the day, the Shabbos on Shabbos, biblically speaking. Over Yom Tif, but on holidays, midivrei sofim, it's rabbinic. Okay, now Yom Tif, as you mentioned already, is entirely rabbinic to begin with. But nonetheless, even rabbinic mitzvahs that are time bound, women are exempt from. Right? So the fact that women are obligated equally to men on Shabbos biblically and Yom Tif rabbinically requires explanation. How so? Even though all positive commandments that are time bound, Nashim P'turas Mena, women are exempt from them. The Kiddush Hayoim, when it comes to sanctifying the day of Shabbos, Chayavos, they are obligated. Why is that? Shenemar, because the verse reads, Zacheres Yoim, etc. Remember or make mention of the day of Shabbos sanctified, etc. That is the way the Torah phrases the command of Shabbos at the first set of 10 commandments in Shemais. And Nemar, the verse reads, in the second time of the 10 commandments, Shomaras Yom, etc. Guard the day to keep Shabbos holy. Right? We mentioned this before. This is the famous pasuk, what the Gemara explains. Pasuk Atilim, Achas Dibra Lakim Shtaim Zu Shamati. God speaks, one I heard two. In one breath, and we make mention of this idea in our L'chadodi. We say in the poem of L'chadodi, Shomer v'zacha b'dibur echad. Guard and remember were said in one speech. And therefore, when the Torah relates the 10 commandments, the first time it says Zachar. When it relates the second time, it says Shomer. Now, Zachar is a positive commandment. Thou shalt make mention. Shomer is a negative commandment. Guard. Right? That's right. And therefore, we derive, because Zachar and Shomer are attached, therefore we derived. Kol sheyeshne b'shmira, anyone is obligated in the negative commandment to guard the Shabbos, not to do work. Yeshne b'schira is also obligated in the positive commandment, thou shalt make mention. And therefore, because women are instructed to guard the Shabbos, to refrain from doing any prohibited works, which is the negative commandment of thou shalt not do any work. And any negative commandment, even though it's time bound, women are enjoined to fulfill. They're forewarned against violating these prohibitions. So and therefore they are also enjoined and obligated to make mention the positive commandment, which is the kiddush, the sanctification of the day. Yeah, clear? Okay. Now he only focuses on Shabbos here because that's our discussion, not Yom Tov. Though he said before that women are obligated in the rabbinic commandment of Yom Tov. Didn't explain it, but presumably the same logic applies. The Torah obligates do not do work on Yom Tov. It's a negative commandment, and therefore women are obligated. And therefore anything associated with that negative commandment, even the rabbinic positive ones, are also obligated upon them.
Right,
it's the same logic.
Realize that a lot of the rabbinic commandments just safeties around the biblical.
Right. But here, when it comes to Shabbos, it's not just that the sages said, hey, because you're obligated in the prohibition, the sages are going to give you the positive make kiddush. It's actually biblical. Because biblically speaking, Zohar and Shamar are intertwined, therefore, biblically speaking, they're obligated in the kiddush. This is the big kiddush here. In other words, one could have reasoned and said, biblically, they're only obligated in the prohibition of not working. The sages came and said, because you're prohibited from working, you should also make kiddush. He says, no. Because the prohibition to stay away from work on Shabbos, and the commandment sanctify Shabbos are linked. Therefore, biblically speaking, women are obligated in kiddush.
So here it's the negative commandment that's being tied in with the positive commandment.
That's correct. On a biblical level. Because biblically they're attached. Zachar and Shamar are attached. They're really one. It's one word from God, literally. Right?
But the question is whether or not that same analysis can apply to rabbinic.
For Yom Tov. Yes, it could, which is why it does. But the obligation remains rabbinic. But here on Shabbos, the obligation for women becomes biblical.
Right.
It's not the sages saying, hey, because you're keeping Shabbos anyway, you might as well also make kiddush. It's biblically speaking, because you're obligated in refraining from work, you're biblically obligated to sanctify the Shabbos as well.
So remember and guard are two of the same, because if you're remembering, you have to do it, you want to do it.
Right. So here it's the other way around. Because you're told to guard, therefore you also have to remember. You have to make remember verbally, make mention to sanctify it.
Both are intertwined.
Yeah. Halacha vav. Yeah, we're almost getting to the point I was making earlier. And considering the fact that women are obligated in the sanctification of Shabbos and the Kiddush on equal footing to men, biblically, therefore, theoretically, they can make Kiddush for a man, equal obligation. Ella, but nevertheless, in the first instance, you should not instruct someone who asks to do so. So if a couple comes to you and says, hey, can my wife make Kiddush for me? You shouldn't necessarily instruct that they should do so. Halacha l'mais that they actually act.
She could, but she should.
Why? He puts in the parentheses, you shouldn't make light of the mitzvahs. Yeah, women can do it, men can do it. Keep the structure. It creates a certain, what's the word? The ceremonious nature of it maintains its dignity and its integrity. And as soon as you start throwing it around and saying, yeah, no big deal, she can make it, you can make it, then it starts to lose its weight. I'm sorry if this is not woke. But so it is. Okay. But in theory, at least I can. Which means, by the way, if the situation is such that, I don't know, the man's in pain, he can't make Kiddush. Okay, so the woman can make Kiddush for him and he can say, Amen. If there's an extraneous circumstance which doesn't allow him to make Kiddush for whatever reason, or it's uncomfortable for him to make Kiddush, then she can do it for him. Right? Because at least on the actual legal level, she made equal footing.
Could it also be because our obligation is not exactly as clear?
No. Once we say it's biblical, it's biblical. It's biblical, it's biblical. Doesn't say that. He doesn't say, because it's not as explicit. Doesn't say that.
To be derived through some sort of.
But exegesis is also biblical. Kal v'chomer is biblical. Gzera shava is biblical, right? It's biblical. Even though it's derivative, but it's derivative of biblical ruling.
Yeah, no.
So he doesn't say because the women are of a lesser standing in their obligation. On the contrary, he says they're equal standing. But so that people don't take it lightly, keep the structure of the man making Kiddush.
If the man is sitting with his wife and son who's over 13, or 13 years old,
Yeah.
the son could do it also.
Yeah, we're going to get to that right now. We're going to get to that right now. But I'm going to add something also. It could be, if you want to give it like a modern understanding, we say that we don't want people to take mitzvahs lightly when we say the woman could do so. It could also be because men have a fragile sense of ego. And unless they're making kiddush, they're going to say, yeah, the man has, a woman is very proud to have her husband make kiddush. Men are a little bit more fragile, and unless they're taking the lead, they feel like they're second class. They feel like, so it could be something of that nature as well.
I think I read in Rambam or something regarding benching that the son should not lead the benching. His father, part of the zimun, or his father being present at the meal, because it brings cursing.
Well, because the poor guy can't read, his son can read, he can't. Maybe it's the other way around. His wife can, right? Something like that.
Reading was just about doing it in general.
Yeah, there was something. I remember that also. Yeah.
But it was something.
Yeah. We might get into
this.
Yeah. We might get into that. Okay, so we'll read the next halacha. Actually, no, we're going to put it for tomorrow because the point I made earlier is associated with the next halacha. I'm going to need more time to unpack it. But I'll just share with you a Chassidus Shavart on what we just learned. Zachar b'shamar b'dibur echad. Right? We read in Yelucha Dodi. Zachar b'shamar b'dibur echad. That in one utterance, God said both remember and guard. Right? The first time that the Ten Commandments appear in the Torah, it says, remember, make mention of the Shabbos. And the second time the Ten Commandments appear in the Torah, when Moshe Rabbeinu repeats it in Parshas Veschanon, it says, Shomer, guard. Right? And our sages explain, based on the verse in Tehillim, that God said both words at one go. And therefore in the Chadodi we say, Shomer v'zacha b'dibur echad. You said, Shomer, guard, zacha, and remember, b'dibur echad in one speech. We say this in the Chadodi. So there's a Chassidus Shavart. There was a chassid who came to the Alter Rebbe in Yechidus. And the Alter Rebbe told him, Shomer, remember, Shamar, guard, the Zacha, and remember, B'dibur, in every one of the words you say, Echad, the oneness of Hashem. Right? The simple reading is Shamar v'Zacha b'dibur Echad. Shamar, remember, Zacha, guard, B'dibur Echad was said in one word, but you could also translate it like this: Shamar, guard, Zacha, remember, B'dibur, in your speech, Echad, the oneness of Hashem. In every word you say, whether you're davening or whether you're saying words of mundane nature, remember the one Hashem. Your davening will be a whole different davening. If in every single word you remembered echad, you remember the oneness of Hashem. And when I'm about to speak a little nice bit of gossip, and remember, b'dibur, in my speech, echad, the oneness of Hashem, maybe I'll be a little more guarding, a little shomer, a little more guarding in my speech. And the story goes that this chassid spent 40 years working on himself to integrate this teaching, that he should remember and guard in every word the oneness of Hashem. Okay, wonderful day, Eden.